All right, so another question that's come up is the role of behaviors in susceptibility for disease. This came up specifically in the context of HIV, whether someone was asking whether specific behaviors make someone more likely to be, more susceptible to HIV. And I think this raises a very important point in that many of the properties of the transmission that we talk about are in fact the aggregate of various different processes that are acting in serial. There's the exposure to the pathogen, there's the invasion of the pathogen into the host, and then there's the establishment of that pathogen, the replication of that pathogen, and the development into disease symptoms, right? And each of those things can be affected by underlying biology or by behaviors associated with these, with each individual. And so in many cases, behaviors are very important in the rate of exposure to a disease, right? But not necessarily important to the ability of that pathogen to invade the body, right? And I know, Rachel, you've worked to some extent on this in terms of behaviors and to some extent. This is your entire research program, isn't it?
I've been promoted.
Well, on the interaction between behavior and disease transmission, and the important difference between an understanding of what things are connected to exposure versus what things are connected to the disease process.
Yeah, itself. And I think the place that there's the worry is if we start making it about people, then we can have a tendency to categorize those people then as being source of and the problem for an infection and continue down a path that may have nothing to do with the disease transmission. So we've just labeled a group as the cause and the reason and those that are likely to get, and then we can even continue down, we can quarantine them, we can remove them, and it had potentially nothing to do with any kind of common characteristics, say religion or behavior or morphology. It just was their kind of exposure that was the problem, and it's the behavior itself that we have to be monitoring, right? So there's this question, as you brought up, is there something about using needles for drug use that is going to put you at risk? So is being the drug user, the category of person, the problem? Or is it the number of times you may be exposed because of a needle that is different than the rate of exposure that might be through some other route? And so as we go to categorize people as the problem and categorize them in that way, we could really gloss over all of what is very thoughtfully carried out in the transmission dynamics. Like, what was the exposure? What's rate of exposure? So one great example in terms of misconceptions, if you asked, they had couples that were being asked, what's the general rate that a man would be likely to contract HIV through unprotected sex? For one encounter, what's the likelihood? And the women all said 70%. 70% likelihood in that one encounter if a man had sex with a woman who was HIV positive that he would contract HIV. And for the women, it was, the men said like 65%. They were sure they were a little more robust than women did. And the actual rate is dramatically lower for any given sort of moment. So confusing categories of people with types of exposure, with susceptibility, all of that makes everything about understanding the biology of it much more confused. And we could be spending our time on the wrong thing. We could be spending our time trying to find people when that's not the problem. We need to find the behavior and modify that behavior.
I think it's important to make these distinctions between the various different events in the chain that lead from one infectious person to another infectious person, so we can identify the appropriate targets for control. Again, as we've discussed in the last response, many of the most effective controls we have been cultural controls or behavioral controls or non-pharmaceutical controls, right? And so susceptibility per se is a biological response in a sense, and if that's the critical thing, then perhaps that we would target that with with one particular type of intervention. Whereas if it's the exposure that is the predominant driving force in the transmission of a disease or in the variation in transmission from one group to another, then it's the behavior that then needs to be the target of control to be most effective and most cost effective in some sense.
And I think it's interesting, it ties in, this thread ties in very nicely with a lot of the threads on the forum about mathematical modeling and the meaning of the transmission rate and the meaning of the basic reproductive ratio, because these are fairly abstract terms, and there's been a lot of interesting discussion on the forum about what exactly they mean, and rightly so, because these are very complex terms that typically put together all of these things, so it's a compound. So when we're talking about transmission rate and the basic reproductive ratio, that's a compound of all of these events. So it's the rate at which contact happens between individuals, so that's the exposure part, the probability that you're going to get infected given an exposure, etc., etc. And so, yeah, so it's a very important topic.
I still think an important part of what we still need to know is being able to explain the variation in susceptibility between individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, of course we know if you were exposed to this pathogen before and you've developed an acquired immunity, then you're going to be very resistant against it. And yes, we know about co-infections can make you more susceptible. But there again, we still need a lot of research to try and understand why I'm more susceptible to one infection than you are, and vice versa.